Hij wordt ook wel de godfather van de mensenrechten genoemd. Bijna 30 jaar was advocaat Kenneth Roth directeur van de mensenrechtenorganisatie Human Rights Watch. Zijn organisatie documenteerde minutieus mensenrechten schendingen en zorgde voor rapporten waarover gretig werd bericht in de media. En die met angstige ogen werden gelezen door autocraten, maar ook democratisch gekozen leiders. Ze zorgden voor hoofdpijn. En in sommige landen is die persona non grata, zoals in China en Egypte. Maar ook de Israëlische regering die ziet hem liever gaan dan komen. Nu, 66 jaar oud, stopt hij deze zomer met zijn werk na bijna 3 decennia vechten tegen onrecht. Welkom, Kenneth Roth.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming in from New York, where your headquarters are. First of all, I was wondering, when was the first time that the term human rights were important to you, or that you heard of it and thought, this is crucial maybe in my life?
Well, ironically, the thing that was most important for me was listening to stories of my father. My father was a Jew in Nazi Germany, and I grew up listening to stories of life under Hitler. He fled Frankfurt, Germany at age 12 for New York. His immediate family was saved, others were killed. But I grew up very aware of the evil that governments could do. And I think that's part of what set me on a path to want to devote myself to trying to prevent that kind of evil going forward.
It should not happen again. Was that the motivation?
That was a big part of the motivation, yes.
If we do a little tour du monde, if I could say,
yes.
Name it like that. Shall we start with Russia and President Putin?
Of course.
You had an organization. Your organization was based in Moscow. Not anymore, right?
We had an office in Moscow for 30 years. The day after Human Rights Watch investigators put out a report about Russian war crimes in Bucha, the day after, Russia shut down our office.
We remember the images of the people being slaughtered there on the street.
It was horrible, and sadly, not isolated. Putin has been fighting this war in Ukraine using a very similar war crime strategy to the way he fought in Syria, and the way going back in time he fought in Chechnya to suppress an insurgency there. And this involves, not only occasional summary executions, but most generally the indiscriminate bombardment of cities and actually the targeting of civilian institutions like hospitals or schools and the like.
Do you see elements of the Second World War here?
Well, the Second World War, one of the things it gave birth to was the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which essentially, to simplify it, say that you can shoot at the other side's soldiers, but you cannot shoot at the other side's civilians. You've got to always target military targets, you cannot use indiscriminate means, and you certainly cannot target the other side's civilians or the civilian institutions. And what Putin has basically done is just ripped up the Geneva Conventions. It says, when the going gets tough, when it's difficult to proceed by simply attacking the Ukrainian military, or the Syrian military for that matter, I'm going to attack the other side's civilians. This is a blatant war crime strategy. It is antithetical to the rules that are supposed to govern war since the Second World War.
Right. So, as you explained, the source of 30 years in human rights comes from your dad, being in Nazi Germany, getting out of there, and then it all happens again, not on that scale that you were mentioning, but it happens again, and you cannot report on it anymore, or can you?
Well, of course we can report on it still. In other words, we have people in Ukraine now, so we're reporting every single day.
But Moscow, not so much. That's where you go.
What we've found over the years, governments, one tactic they use to try to silence Human Rights Watch is to try to expel our researchers. I myself have been expelled from places. What we've learned to do is we can still monitor remotely. So in a place like Russia, we have, decades of contacts with local activists. You can still telephone people. We have no problem getting information out about Putin's crackdown in Russia, and we're publishing that.
Are you pessimistic about what is happening in the war in Ukraine? Because it looks like a stalemate. I don't know exactly what is happening. Nobody knows exactly.
Well, militarily, it does seem to be a stalemate at the moment. What gives me hope is if you look in Russia, for example, why is it that Putin is imposing the most intense censorship, pursuing the most extensive disinformation, threatening 15-year prison terms against people who criticize the war? It's because he's terrified of the response of the Russian people. And you know, this is, in a sense, the most intense repression since the Soviet era.
So you see that as a positive element?
I see that as positive because we've seen, despite all that repression, despite the disinformation, we've seen protests break out in 150 cities across Russia. So the Russian people are not happy with this war crime strategy being pursued in their name. And that does give me hope.
Let's go a little bit to the east, to China.
Yes.
2 years ago, you were very active on Twitter. We saw this little clip. You were filming yourself. You tried to enter China via Hong Kong, and then this happened.
Even though I've been able to enter Hong Kong freely before, this time, for the first time, they blocked me. They didn't want me to hold the press conference. So I'm going to return to New York. I'll hold the press conference there. But sadly, this episode is just the latest evidence that the Chinese government is doing everything it can to undermine the enforcement of international human rights standards.
January 12th, 2020, Hong Kong airport. We just don't want the guy in our country. We'll send him away. So then the problem is gone. Well,
it didn't work from their perspective. In other words, I had flown to Hong Kong to release Human Rights Watch's annual report. And the main thesis that year was that the Chinese government poses the greatest global threat to the human rights system. It has the economic means and the political intent to try to undermine human rights standards.
Worse than Russia?
Yes, in the sense that, you know, Russia is a military threat today. We see that in Ukraine. But Russia, in essence, you know, people joke about it, but it's a gas station with a military. You know,
a gas station with the military.
It has no soft power. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I wish I could live in a kleptocracy like Putin built. You know, so yes, it is a military threat. But if you look at, you know, who tries to present themselves as an alternative system, that's Xi Jinping, that's China. They say, all you have to worry about is expanding the economy. Don't ask me questions about whether the people have a right to influence their government. I mean, the debate you just had right now about agricultural policy, impossible in China. One man decides things. Don't ask questions about how those resources are allocated, whether people's basic needs are met. You know, what happened to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? What happened to Tibetans? What happened to even rural Han Chinese? You're not allowed to ask those questions. That's Xi Jinping's view of human rights. It's one question, is the economy growing or not? Now, that is a fundamental threat to the global human rights system. And that, in my view, is what we have to keep our mind on. So it's horrible what's happening in Ukraine, but Ukraine represents one example of this global contest between autocracy and democracy. And we have to keep our eyes on that.
Do you, I mean, from your perspective and your research, does it look like more and more people in the world are thinking, well, democracy, it's sort of a broken system. Let's go the other side. Let's go to the autocracy.
Well, I think, you know, implicit in your question, there are problems with democracy. We have to
look at your own country. What a mess it is. I mean, what happened at the Capitol 2 years ago? You almost lost a elected president.
I know. No, we have to recognize that democracies are not delivering to significant segments of their society. But if you ask, you know, do people of the world want autocracy? There has been situation after situation where people have gone to the streets to protest against democracy in favor against autocracy in favor of democracy. In Hong Kong, Thailand, Myanmar, Russia, Belarus, Uganda, you know, Cuba, Nicaragua, Sudan. So this is, you know, a global phenomenon. And whenever you ask people, you know, people don't say, give me a dictatorship. They say, give me democracy.
So you're optimistic there, even after 30 years writing all these terrible reports.
Look, I understand that it is in the nature of governments to violate human rights. It's a way of, you know, getting things done without having to listen to the people. It's a way of staying in power. So you're always going to need a human rights movement to push back, to raise the cost of abuse. But what I see, and I've traveled all around the world, you know, nobody wants their rights violated. People don't want to be tortured. They don't want to be, you know, thrown in jail without a due process. They don't want to be censored.
Yeah.
So these are basically universal values. We have to keep fighting. You know, that's just the nature of the beast. But I am optimistic that the people of the world are on our side.
Right. Let's talk about journalism. Yes. In a way, you are kind of journalist because you're also looking for the facts and presenting them.
Precisely.
As we would do here. As you know, last month, the correspondent of Al Jazeera was killed on the West Bank, doing her work. This is what happened there. We have a little clip of that situation. Yeah. So she's reporting there for many years already, and she was wearing press on her chest, and then got killed in May. This all happened. CNN reported that Israeli snipers have been doing this from the Israeli army. Are you looking into this case? Very important case for journalists all over the world.
This is a very important case. And the Israeli government immediately said, oh, there was crossfire. We don't know really what happened. It was maybe the Palestinians who killed her. That tends to be the standard line.
Do you believe them?
What I believe is we need an independent investigation. The Israeli government has a horrible record of investigating itself, and over again finds it never does anything wrong. So that's why we've called for an investigation really that is, not going to be tainted by the Israeli government's view of itself, but rather will look objectively at why did this journalist with press on her vest, operating apparently, according to CNN, away from any gunfire. Why was she suddenly shot to death? That's what we need to look at.
Yeah. You had very harsh words about the treatment of Israel of the Palestinians. And you even used the word, which is very well known in the Netherlands, it's apartheid.
Yes, we did. And we used the term apartheid in the legal sense of the term. In other words, it wasn't an analogy to South Africa, but rather there are two treaties that define apartheid. And we looked at that and we found an intent by the Israeli government to dominate Palestinians and oppressive discrimination, particularly in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. It was a very detailed report. The Israeli government could find nothing wrong with it factually, nothing wrong with it legally. They just resorted to name-calling to try to change the subject. We thought it was important to do this because the Israeli government's typical response when you say, well, you've got this systematic discrimination against Palestinians is to say, oh, don't worry, it's just a temporary occupation. When the peace process is done, it'll be all solved. We're now like half a century later, still occupation, still no peace in sight. It's time to recognize it for what it is and either have equal rights or recognize that this is apartheid.
When you use that term, apartheid, what was the response of people from Israel and organizations, Jewish organizations, about you? What did they say?
Well, I should say, first of all, the leading Israeli groups share our view on this. B'Tselem, our kind of the most prominent Israeli human rights group, completely shares the analysis. But one way that I understood that we were right about this is that the Israeli government just resorted to name-calling. They had nothing to rebut us on factually or analytically, so they just said, oh, you must be biased, you must be anti-Semitic. And to call me a Jew anti-Semitic is a little ridiculous, and it shows the depths to which they're willing to stoop to try to change the subject from what's really going on.
How did it make you feel, as you just explained to us? You're the son of a father who had to flew from Germany.
Sadly, I've gotten used to this, but I view it as a bit of a victory. If all they can do is that kind of blatant name-calling, they've got no defense. And it's time, I hope, for them to introspect, look at this horribly discriminatory policy, and recognize it is wrong to perpetually subjugate a people like the Palestinians.
Yeah. And maybe also a compliment to you is that there is a lot of respect for the organization that you work for. Human Rights Watch is... people can't miss it anymore. If you write about something, then we will talk about it, as we do now here. So after almost 30 years of fighting your fight for human rights, how do you leave your organization? And more importantly, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about what's going on in the world right now with so many fires flaring up everywhere?
Well, first of all, I'm very proud of the organization that I built. I've got a wonderful group of colleagues. We're always criticized. The Chinese criticize us, the Russians criticize us, the Israelis, the Saudis, you name it. We apply the same investigative methodology, the same human rights standards in every single country. The reason we have the credibility you note is because we are absolutely meticulous in applying this methodology similarly every place. Of course, governments don't like that end result, because we're spotlighting their human rights abuse. That's what we're here to do. Yes, there are many problems in the world today, but there are always problems. I mean, I've lived through ebbs and flows, and it just is like that. What I'm proud of is that Human Rights Watch and the movement of which we are part is actually very capable these days of raising the cost of human rights abuse. And so if a government is sitting back and saying, should we repress these people or not, we want to tip the balance. So they say, well, maybe it's just not worth it. Maybe the flack we're going to get, the media attention, all the criticism, maybe we should just respect human rights after all. And that's when we begin to make some progress.
Thank you very much for coming to the Netherlands, to Buitenhof, and more important, thank you for your very important work that you did over the last 30 years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet dan niet te abonneren. Een like of een reactie achterlaten kan natuurlijk ook. Of bekijk een van de andere interviews op dit kanaal.